999. Early spring in March.
Narrator, tone, cheerful Alice returned home from work and heard Mrs. Smith chatting with a neighbor.
Alice, tone, cheerful mom.
Mrs. Smith, tone, annoyed, why are you so late today? Hurry up and make dinner.
Alice lowered her head and agreed. At 23 years old, Alice had graduated from a teacher's college and was a Chinese teacher at the first elementary school. 6 months after she started working, she married Michael, who now owned the city's entertainment club.
Mrs. Smith, tone, serious, what's the use of having so much money? I want a grandson.
During dinner, Michael unexpectedly came home.
Mrs. Smith, tone, unfriendly Michael, you've been married to Alice for so long, why hasn't she conceived yet? I believe there's nothing wrong with you.
Michael, annoyed by the nagging, threw down his chopsticks and went to the bedroom. Alice cleaned up the dishes and sat down to grade her students' assignments. By the time she finished, it was already 9:30 p.m. She quickly washed up and entered the bedroom.
Alice, tone, sad, I've told you several times, please don't smoke in the bedroom.
Michael extinguished the cigarette and chuckled.
Michael, tone, teasing all right, no smoking. Let's have some fun instead.
Alice's heart tightened. Ever since she found out 2 years ago that Michael was involved with a waitress from the club, she instinctively resisted being intimate with him.
Alice, tone, serious, I'll sleep in the small room.
Unexpectedly, Michael jumped up from the bed, grabbed her hand, and touched her.
Michael, tone, teasing your husband rarely comes home. Don't you miss me?
Michael lifted her chin with his finger, smiling smugly.
Michael, tone, teasing those girls outside can't compare to my wife.
Suddenly, there was a rapid knock on the door. Alice broke free from Michael and went to open the door. It was her good friend and colleague, Sarah.
Alice, tone, cheerful Sarah, what brings you here?
However, Sarah, unlike her usual affectionate self, glanced at Alice disdainfully and walked into the living room with an air of superiority.
Sarah, tone, shouting Michael, come out!
Sarah's voice was loud, waking up Mrs. Smith, who had already gone to bed. Michael and Mrs. Smith both came to the living room.
Michael, tone, serious, what's going on so late?
Sarah weakly leaned against Michael and took out a piece of paper from her bag, handing it to him.
Sarah, tone, sad heartless man, I'm expecting.
Michael, holding the report, was stunned. Upon hearing the word expecting, Mrs. Smith immediately perked up. She rushed to her son's side, snatched the report, and looked at it repeatedly.
Mrs. Smith, tone, excited Michael, is the child yours? This is wonderful.
Sarah, tone, unfriendly auntie, what are you saying? If the child wasn't Michael's, would I come to him?
Mrs. Smith grabbed Sarah's hand, her face full of wrinkles from smiling.
Mrs. Smith, tone, relieved, oh dear, I misspoke earlier. Don't mind me.
Michael, still in shock, was poked in the forehead by Mrs. Smith.
Mrs. Smith, tone, angry you good for nothing, now that the girl is expecting and has come to you, I don't care, I want a grandson.
Michael, tone, serious, really expecting?
Sarah, tone, sad Michael, it's all your fault. What now? Are you trying to deny it?
Michael, tone, serious, no, I just didn't expect it to happen from just once.
At this moment, Mrs. Smith sneered at Alice.
Mrs. Smith, tone, unfriendly, unlike someone who only crows but doesn't lay eggs.
Alice, who had been silent all this time, watched the farcical scene with an unusual calmness. Michael, clutching the report, suddenly said,
Michael, tone, serious, you go first, I'll find you tomorrow.
Sarah, hearing this, was displeased.
Sarah, Tone, angry Michael, who are you telling to leave?
Mrs. Smith glared at Alice.
Mrs. Smith, Tone, angry Alice, our family has treated you well. Don't occupy the spot and do nothing. Pack up and get out.
At this point, Michael also said to Alice.
Michael, Tone, sad I'm sorry, Alice, but Sarah is now expecting.
Alice, Tone, serious, fine, I'll leave.
The last bit of affection Alice had for Michael vanished in that moment. Early the next morning, they went to the Civil Affairs Bureau and swiftly got their divorce certificate. Alice left with nothing and moved back to her parents' home. At home, she had a sick mother and a brother about to graduate. Fearing her family couldn't handle the shock, Alice didn't tell her mother about the divorce. After the divorce, Alice forced herself to focus on her work. She relied on her modest monthly salary to support her mother and brother. However, Sarah constantly stirred up trouble. Just a few days after the divorce, Sarah flaunted a new Motorola flip phone at work, which was even more eye-catching than her light yellow coat. The teachers in the office were envious.
Sarah, that phone costs thousands. Did your boyfriend give it to you? He's so good to you.
Sarah, can I borrow your phone to call my husband? His pager is broken and he can't return calls promptly.
Alice tuned out the office chatter, while Sarah basked in the envious glances of her colleagues. Seeing Alice unmoved, Sarah deliberately asked loudly.
Alice, I heard you and your husband got divorced.
This statement was like a bombshell, causing an uproar in the office. Everyone, driven by curiosity, came to show concern for Alice.
Yes, it's true.
The bell for class saved Alice, and she hurriedly grabbed her books and headed to the classroom. When she returned to the office after class, everyone looked at her strangely. Even the teachers who were usually friendly avoided her like the plague. Alice was puzzled, while Sarah looked at her with a smug smile. When Alice went to get some water, she encountered Mr. Johnson, who taught math in the same grade. Mr. Johnson, usually gentle, gave Alice a long, disdainful look.
Disgusting.
Mr. Johnson, why would you say that about me?
Mr. Johnson, in his 30s and known for his strong sense of justice, looked at her with contempt.
You used to hang out with delinquents in school, had an unplanned pregnancy, and then terminated it, which led to your inability to have children. Alice, you are truly disgusting.
Hearing this, Alice trembled with anger. The cup in her hand fell to the ground, spilling hot water and scattering glass shards everywhere.
Alice, what are you doing? You can't stop others from talking about your behavior.
I'm sorry.
Alice muttered an apology and rushed back to the office. She held her breath as she stood at the office door. Sarah and a few teachers were whispering together. As soon as they saw Alice, they exchanged glances and fell silent. Alice clenched her fists and walked up to Sarah, angrily questioning her.
Sarah, did you spread those nasty rumors about me?
Sarah stood up, looking Alice up and down with disdain.
Alice, you know better than anyone whether you hung out with delinquents and terminated pregnancies. I don't need to spread rumors.
Alice, usually gentle, had never lost her temper in front of so many people. This time, she couldn't hold back.
Sarah, you're spouting nonsense. There's a higher power watching over us. Aren't you afraid of retribution?
Sarah, not to be outdone, raised her voice even louder than Alice's.
Alice, how dare you talk about retribution? Do you think you can justify what you did to those unborn children?
You're full of lies. It's infuriating.
Alice slapped Sarah, releasing all her pent-up grievances. Sarah was not one to be easily bullied. As soon as she felt the slap, she burst into tears. The office fell into an awkward silence. At that moment, Michael appeared at the office door. Michael walked straight into the office, and Sarah, with tears streaming down her face, threw herself into his arms.
Darling, this awful woman bullied me.
Sarah pointed angrily at Alice. Seeing the confusion on everyone's faces, Sarah let go of Michael and proudly addressed the group.
Let me introduce you all. This is my fiancé. We will be getting married at the Jingxian Hotel next month. Invitations will be sent out soon.
Michael and Alice are already divorced because she was involved with unsavory people after their marriage.
Alice closed her eyes, wishing she could disappear. Sarah wrapped her arms around Michael's neck and said coyly,
Darling, although family matters shouldn't be aired publicly, now that you and Alice are divorced, there's nothing to hide. Tell everyone, was she still a virgin when she married you?
Alice looked at Michael, hoping he would defend her. She had married Michael with a pure heart and body. Michael glanced at Alice and said dismissively,
No, she wasn't.
Those words hit Alice like a bolt from the blue. With her goal achieved, Sarah pulled Michael away quickly, leaving Alice to face the ridicule of her colleagues. That evening, it started to drizzle. Alice found herself at a roadside bar, drinking alone. Her face flushed, she wobbled as she pushed her bicycle, heading home. Suddenly, a brand new Mercedes stopped in front of her. A distinguished young man stepped out of the car and stood before Alice.
Miss, can you tell me how to get to Wutong Lane?
I live on Wutong Lane, it's nearby. Follow me.
David came from 2018. When he was a teenager, he and his mother rented a place at 18 Wutong Lane. By 2018, Wutong Lane had long been demolished. But David missed his mother dearly, especially the time they spent on Wutong Lane. So he spent a fortune to travel back to 1999 using a time machine. He hoped to see his mother again in this time. However, after nearly 20 years, David had forgotten the exact location of Wutong Lane. David parked his car and followed Alice. Suddenly, Alice collapsed, unconscious. Michael, clutching the report, suddenly spoke up.
You go first, I'll find you tomorrow.
Sarah, hearing this, was displeased.
Michael, who are you telling to leave?
Mrs. Smith glared at Alice.
Alice, our family has treated you well. Don't occupy the spot and do nothing. Pack up and get out.
At this point, Michael also spoke to Alice.
I'm sorry, Alice, but Sarah is now expecting.
Before he could finish, Alice interrupted him.
Fine, I'll leave.
The last bit of affection Alice had for Michael vanished in that moment. Early the next morning, they went to the Civil Affairs Bureau and swiftly got their divorce certificate. Alice left with nothing and moved back to her parents' home. At home, she had a sick mother and a brother about to graduate. Fearing her family couldn't handle the shock, Alice didn't tell her mother about the divorce. 2 hours later, Alice returned to the hospital, feeling dejected. Mr. Clark had heard rumors and, for the sake of the school's reputation, planned to dismiss her. No matter how Alice explained, it was useless. Losing her job wasn't the worst part, it was that her already fragile family would lose its main support. Her brother, Tom, was far away in Beijing, with 6 months left until graduation, and his living expenses would be in jeopardy. Alice leaned against the hospital bed, waiting for her mother to wake up. David, seeing her sorrowful expression, couldn't help but feel pity.
Alice, how old are you?
23. Why do you ask?
David thought back to when his mother moved into Wutong Lane at the age of 23. 10 years later, she passed away at 33. After spending half a day with Alice, he felt a slight attraction towards her.
Nothing, you just look younger than 18.
His words cleverly eased the tension. Alice looked at David curiously.
Where are you from? Your accent doesn't sound local.
I'm from the South, but I grew up here.
Are you here to find relatives?
My only relative is no longer here.
Alice didn't know what to say. She could imagine David's sadness.
By the way, I'll repay the hospital fees you covered for me as soon as possible.
It's just a small amount, no need to repay.
David looked at Alice openly. Her eyes were dark and deep, with a faint sadness.
No, I can't do that. Your money didn't come easily.
As you wish, but you should take care of yourself first.
Thinking about the school situation and her family's plight, Alice smiled bitterly.
Can things get any worse?
You have to believe that what doesn't break you will only make you stronger.
Thank you. I won't let anyone take advantage of me again.
Before long, Mr. Clark called Alice again, this time to tell her she didn't need to resign. It turned out that a student in Alice's class had won a national essay competition, and the City Education Bureau planned to give her a special commendation next week. Before dinner, Alice's mother, who had been unconscious, also woke up. Alice suddenly felt that life wasn't so bad after all. Since he had traveled to the wrong time, David felt he should return to 2018 as soon as possible. There were many tasks waiting for him in the real world. Before leaving, he exchanged some gold reserves for money and quietly placed it under Alice's mother's pillow. He also left a note for Alice.
Don't be afraid. Be brave. Everything will get better.
David took the time machine back to 2018. After he left, Alice felt a void in her heart. Her bicycle was stolen, so she used the money David left to buy a new one. Sarah spread rumors in the office, vividly claiming that Alice had gotten the bicycle through improper means. When Alice decided she couldn't tolerate it any longer, she went to confront Sarah.
At the end of next month, Michael and I are having a reception at the Morning Light Hotel. Don't forget to come, my dear friend.
Holding the invitation, Alice felt all her strength drain away. One day, on her way home, she passed a street vendor selling fried dough sticks and felt a wave of nausea. With mixed feelings, Alice bought a pregnancy test from a pharmacy and secretly tested it at home. 2 lines appeared. She couldn't believe it and took a day off to rush to the hospital. A checkup confirmed she was pregnant.
Weren't you the one who came for fertility tests 6 months ago? You forgot to pick up your results.
The doctor found the results from 6 months ago and smiled at her.
Young lady, you must have remarried. That's why you're pregnant.
Alice picked up the test results. Her reproductive health was normal, but Michael had a condition that made him infertile. Fate played a cruel trick as Alice ran into Sarah in the hospital corridor, who was there for a prenatal checkup.
Oh, you're here for fertility tests? By the way, you must come to my and Michael's wedding to witness our happiness.
Don't worry, I'll send the wedding gift.
David had been back since 2018. His father forced him to marry the daughter of the Zhang family, but David resisted, even at the cost of giving up his position as the heir of the Cui family. Without the Cui family, David's life was better. The tech company he invested in went public in the US this month. His father had no choice but to give up. Lately, he often dreamed of Alice, holding a baby, waiting for him at the entrance of Wutong Alley. That night, Alice went out to buy fruit for her mother and was blocked by 2 thugs at the alley entrance.
Didn't expect this girl to be so feisty.
They approached Alice with lewd expressions.
What are you doing?
Mind your own business, kid, or I'll teach you a lesson.
David rushed forward and quickly knocked the 2 thugs to the ground, who begged for mercy.
Get lost. Don't let me see you again.
The 2 thugs scrambled away. David approached Alice, who was so scared she collapsed to the ground. David squatted down and picked her up.
David, I was so scared.
Alice, I'm sorry. It's my fault. I came too late. I'm sorry. Please don't cry.
At that moment, David, who had lived for 28 years, finally understood what it felt like to be moved. Half an hour later, Alice wiped away her tears and brought David home. Mrs. Brown greeted David warmly as soon as she saw him.
Welcome, David. Please, come in.
David politely smiled at Mrs. Brown.
Alice, go wash the fruit. I need to speak with David.
In just 3 minutes, Mrs. Brown asked David about his job and family background. After hearing his answers, Mrs. Brown felt deflated. David's conditions were too good. Only a daughter from a wealthy family could match such a young talent like David, while her daughter Alice, born into poverty and divorced, was worlds apart from him. David looked up at Alice, the dim incandescent light adding a unique glow to her fair face. The house was too small, with only enough room for a sofa, a chair, and a small table in the living room. Alice had no place to sit and could only stand awkwardly in the room.
Where are you staying?
I'm temporarily staying at the Jingxian Hotel.
It's late now. You should go back to the hotel and rest early.
David nodded and stood up. Alice walked him to the door.
This is far enough. Go back. Don't overthink or be afraid. With me around, no one will dare to bully you.
His words brought tears to Alice's eyes immediately. Michael, clutching the report, suddenly said,
You go first, I'll find you tomorrow.
Sarah, hearing this, was displeased.
Michael, who are you telling to leave?
Mrs. Smith glared at Alice.
Alice, our family has treated you well. Don't occupy the spot and do nothing. Pack up and get out.
At this point, Michael also spoke to Alice.
I'm sorry, Alice, but Sarah is now expecting.
Before he could finish, Alice interrupted him.
Fine, I'll leave.
The last bit of affection Alice had for Michael vanished in that moment. Early the next morning, they went to the Civil Affairs Bureau and swiftly got their divorce certificate. Alice left with nothing and moved back to her parents' home. At home, she had a sick mother and a brother about to graduate. Fearing her family couldn't handle the shock, Alice didn't tell her mother about the divorce.
Lice spoke dejectedly to David.
In 2 days, Sarah and Michael will have their wedding at this hotel.
Avid gave a mischievous smile.
Isn't that even better? Most of the teachers from school will be there. Exposing their true colors in front of everyone will be thrilling.
Lice bit her lip, looking worried.
They've gone too far. But I've never argued with anyone since kindergarten. I really don't know what to do.
Avid, amused by her innocent demeanor, patted her head.
Leave it to me.
Soon, the hotel waiter brought the dishes David had ordered. David handed Alice a set of utensils and urged her to eat.
Don't just sit there, eat up.
As Alice looked at the delicious food, a wave of nausea surged from her stomach. She stumbled to the bathroom and vomited into the toilet. David stood outside the bathroom door, completely stunned.
David quickly poured a glass of warm water and brought it to her. She weakly shook her head.
I'll be fine after this. Sorry you had to see me like this.
Avid handed her the glass with a friendly tone.
I've seen you without clothes, so why be polite now?
Lice took the glass and, before drinking, boldly asked David a question.
You're single, right? Do you have a girlfriend or fiancé?
Avid was taken aback for a long time, placing his hands on her shoulders.
Alice, I came all this way to find you because you were the only woman for me.
Hearing those words made Alice's heart race and her face flush.
Alice looked down and nervously voiced her thoughts.
David, you know I'm a divorced woman.
Avid immediately interrupted her.
My memory isn't that bad.
Lisa's voice grew smaller.
So we're not suitable.
Avid flicked her forehead lightly.
You silly woman, what's not suitable?
He decided to lay it all out.
You're dating a divorced woman. Won't your parents object?
Avid realized it was 1999, and her mindset was understandably old-fashioned. He pulled Alice into his arms.
Silly, I not only want you as my girlfriend, I want to marry you.
Alice leaned into his embrace, her eyes wide with tears streaming down. He said he wanted to marry her. Alice didn't respond, keeping her head down, lost in thought.
If you don't eat, the food will get cold. I want to take care of you and marry you.
My stomach doesn't feel well. I don't want to eat.
Get some sleep first. If you still feel unwell when you wake up, we'll go to the hospital.
Alice was too tired and uncomfortable, and soon fell into a hazy sleep. David had already thought of a way to deal with Michael and Sarah. David's plan was extravagant. He wanted to buy the hotel. He returned to the sofa, took a few bites of food, and began contacting the senior management of the hotel. After eating and a quick wash, David lay down on the other side of the bed. Sensing his presence, Alice turned over, facing him. David couldn't resist and gently tapped Alice's small nose.
What time is it now? How long have I slept?
David extended his hand in front of Alice, showing her the watch on his wrist.
Are you hungry?
Not hungry. I feel much better after sleeping.
She tried to get up, but David's strong arm pulled her back onto the bed, pinning her down. Their position was as intimate as it could be.
But I'm hungry.
David's kiss fell, starting as light as a feather on her lips, but soon turned into a storm, as if he wanted to devour her. Alice's resistance seemed more like a playful tease. David stopped and smiled, a mix of elegance and roguishness.
You know, I love it when you play hard to get.
Alice was both angry and embarrassed, not knowing what to do.
I don't believe you don't have feelings for me, and I don't believe your body doesn't want me.
David's kiss fell again, and as he kissed, he began to undress himself. As if under a spell, Alice raised her hands to wrap around David's neck, responding to his kiss. Alice thought of the child and closed her eyes, whispering,
Be gentle.
David was very considerate of her feelings, and they slowly became one, enjoying each other. Alice knew what they were doing was wrong, especially with the child still inside her. She decided to have the child and leave with her mother. Having made up her mind, Alice seemed even more passionate, and David responded to her. David held the now sleepy Alice.
Get up and eat something.
Michael was clutching the report tightly, his voice tense as he spoke to Sarah.
You go first, I'll find you tomorrow.
Sarah's face was filled with displeasure upon hearing his words.
Michael, who are you telling to leave?
Mrs. Smith's gaze turned cold as she looked at Alice.
Alice, our family has treated you well. Don't occupy the spot and do nothing. Pack up and get out.
Michael turned to Alice with a solemn look.
I'm sorry, Alice, but Sarah is now expecting.
Before he could finish, Alice interrupted him, her voice filled with determination.
Fine, I'll leave.
The last bit of affection Alice had for Michael vanished in that moment. Early the next morning, they went to the Civil Affairs Bureau and swiftly got their divorce certificate. Alice left with nothing and moved back to her parents' home. At home, she had a sick mother and a brother about to graduate. Fearing her family couldn't handle the shock, Alice didn't tell her mother about the divorce.
You go first, I'll find you tomorrow.
Michael, who are you telling to leave?
Alice, our family has treated you well. Don't occupy the spot and do nothing. Pack up and get out.
Michael, clutching the report, added more disappointment.
I'm sorry, Alice, but Sarah is now expecting.
Fine, I'll leave.
The last bit of affection Alice had for Michael vanished in that moment. Early the next morning, they went to the Civil Affairs Bureau and swiftly got their divorce certificate. Alice left with nothing and moved back to her parents' home. At home, she had a sick mother and a brother about to graduate. Fearing her family couldn't handle the shock, Alice didn't tell her mother about the divorce. Mrs. Brown looked incredulous, then delighted, and after the delight, she became worried.
How long have you known each other? You just got divorced. How well do you know him?
You don't need to worry about that. David is someone I can trust.
Alice reassured her mother.
Mom, don't worry. I really like David. If you agree to us being together, I'll accept his proposal tomorrow. If you don't agree, then
Alice, you're grown up now. You can make your own decisions. Since you like him, I support you. But I hope you protect yourself and don't get hurt again.
Alice buried her face in her mother's lap, playfully acting like a child. Suddenly, Mrs. Brown worriedly said,
Alice, you were married to Michael for 3 years and didn't conceive. Is it your issue or his? If it's our problem, we must be honest. I can't agree to your marriage with David.
Alice stood up and went to her room to find Michael's medical report, handing it to her mother.
What is this? I don't understand.
Mom, this is Michael's medical report. It shows he has fertility issues, so it's not my problem. You can rest assured.
Mrs. Brown's face relaxed a lot. Remembering the suffering her daughter endured at the Liu family, she cried in pain. Alice ran over to hug her mother.
Mom, don't cry. It's all in the past.
Good child, I'm just heartbroken for you. But this divorce was the right decision. This afternoon, Mrs. Zhang from next door told me that Michael is getting married again. To Sarah, is it true?
Alice nodded.
What? Those two are simply despicable, especially Sarah. You grew up together, and I treated her like my own daughter, yet she...
Mrs. Brown trembled with anger. Alice hugged her mother tighter.
Mom, it's all in the past. Don't be angry. Mom, David is coming to propose tomorrow afternoon. Do you have any requests? I'll let him know.
Why isn't he coming in the morning?
Alice laughed at how her mother was like a child.
He's preparing for the proposal in the morning.
Look at me, getting more confused as I get older. As long as you're willing, I have no requests.
Alice talked with her mother late into the night before going to bed. As she lay in bed, her mind was filled with thoughts of David. Early the next morning, Alice woke up and, together with her mother, cleaned the house to welcome David. It was already 3 in the afternoon. After lunch, Mrs. Brown asked Alice more than once.
David won't stand you up, will he?
He will definitely come.
The two of them sat in the house, and soon there was a commotion in the alley. Alice went out and saw David leading a group of people towards her house. She quickly returned inside, shouting,
Mom, he's here.
If it weren't for her beaming smile and cheerful tone, Mrs. Brown would have thought her daughter was being chased. In no time, David entered the house, followed by about 10 people. Alice saw 2 men carrying a whole pig. There were also gifts, cigarettes, alcohol, fruits, and high-end gift boxes. Neighbors came rushing over, filling Alice's small courtyard.
I'm here.
Mrs. Brown quickly welcomed everyone inside. David entered, followed by a man holding a tray, while the rest stayed outside. The curious neighbors squeezed in, and David's people started handing out red envelopes and candy.
Auntie, I'm David. I'm here today to propose. Please allow Alice to marry me. First, I apologize. My family is in the South, and they are very busy with business. But they will definitely visit you in person.
Mrs. Brown couldn't stop smiling.
Auntie, this is a small token of appreciation. Thank you for raising Alice. You've worked hard. In the future, Alice and I will take care of you together.
Mrs. Brown was moved to tears. Everyone present stared at the money, their faces full of envy. Many had never seen so much money in their lives. Mrs. Brown invited David to sit down. Alice poured him a glass of water, and the curious neighbors were reluctant to leave.
Thank you for your blessings. Please accept the red envelopes and candy, and give us a quiet environment.
The crowd, understanding the hint, reluctantly left. The alley was abuzz with talk about David. The small house instantly quieted down, leaving only David, Alice, and Mrs. Brown.
This morning, I bought the Jingxian Hotel. Here is the share transfer document, which is also my betrothal gift to you.
Mrs. Brown was so shocked that her mouth hung open, wide enough to swallow a large egg. Alice glanced at the transfer document and handed it back to David.
This dowry is too much, I can't accept it.
David realized he had gone too far and put away the document with a smile.
After all, we'll be family soon.
Alice smiled too, feeling more touched than ever. David's thoughtful gesture allowed her to hold her head high in front of the neighbors. He not only gave her love but also protected her dignity. The three of them chatted happily for a while. Just then, Alice's pager went off. It was a call from Sarah. David noticed her troubled expression, took the pager from her, and handed her a mobile phone from his suit pocket.
Call her back and tell her you'll definitely attend her wedding tomorrow.
Alice complied. When the call connected, Sarah's sharp voice came through.
Alice, I heard you didn't go to school today. The principal is furious and wants to fire you, but don't worry, I'm here for you. Oh, and make sure you come to my wedding with Michael tomorrow.
Alice wasn't angry at all now, but she didn't want to engage with Sarah either. She just responded with a simple
Because of my wedding, the principal gave everyone a day off.
Alice knew that Sarah had invited all the teachers to her wedding, hoping to make a spectacle of her. After hanging up, Mrs. Brown felt indignant for her daughter, but Alice comforted her.
Mom, it's a happy day, let's not talk about unpleasant things.
David chimed in, then turned to Mrs. Brown.
Auntie, don't worry, I'll take good care of Alice. Thank you for agreeing to let us be together.
David, with you by Alice's side, I'm relieved. You two rest at home, I'll go inform everyone.
Alice stopped her mother.
Mom, I'll call Tom and have him come back from school to help. You should rest more, so your legs don't hurt again.
Mrs. Brown agreed. After the call, Tom said he had no more classes and could come back soon. Alice wandered around the streets for a long time, occasionally thinking of David, a smile naturally appearing on her face. When she returned home, the neighbors had already left, and her mother was sitting inside, reminiscing about the day's dreamlike events. The next morning, David drove to pick up Alice. They arrived at the hotel earlier than Sarah and Michael and rested in David's room. David opened the wardrobe and took out a long white dress, even more elegant than the one Alice had seen the day before.
Try it on! I bought it at the mall yesterday.
After zipping up, David led Alice to the full-length mirror. Her image and demeanor were no less than that of a high society lady. Alice curiously examined herself in the mirror, feeling like a different person. The elevator stopped on the 3rd floor, where Sarah and Michael's wedding was being held. David, holding Alice's hand, confidently walked into the banquet hall.
Alice, how dare you come to the wedding?
Sorry, your daughter-in-law personally invited me.
Mrs. Davis noticed the tall and handsome David beside Alice and advised.
Young man, there are plenty of good girls out there. Why are you so unlucky to fall for my ex-daughter-in-law? Don't you know she's a disgrace?
Who the disgrace is will be revealed soon enough.
David replied with a sly smile on his stern face. Mrs. Davis angrily grabbed David's suit, cursing.
Where did these shameless people come from? You're not welcome at my son's wedding.
David forcefully shook off Mrs. Davis's hand and escorted Alice into the banquet hall. Half an hour later, the wedding banquet began. Sarah, in a white wedding dress, and Michael, in a black suit, stood on the stage. Alice looked at the two on stage, one was her ex-husband, the other her former friend. Now they were getting married. The thought was laughable. People around were not looking at the couple on stage, but were instead pointing at Alice and David. No wonder, David was far more handsome than the groom, and Alice was effortlessly outshining the bride. After the dishes were served, Alice spoke up.
Since we're here and we've given the gift money, we might as well eat.
Suddenly, two middle-aged men in security uniforms appeared in front of them. Then, Mrs. Davis emerged from behind the tall security guard. She pointed at Alice and David, furiously saying,
Get these two out of here immediately.
Ma'am, since the lady doesn't welcome you, please leave voluntarily. It will be better for everyone.
Alice's face turned as red as a freshly cooked lobster. David remained silent, looking at her.
The bride invited me to the wedding. Why should I leave?
Alice, you little troublemaker, get out of here. You're not welcome.
I contributed to the wedding gift. Why can't I stay for the banquet? Besides, this hotel belongs to my fiancé's family. It's not your place to tell me to leave.
The argument quickly drew the attention of the guests. Sarah interrupted the MC and walked over, holding Michael's hand. Alice's words were a thunderbolt to Mrs. Davis. Her face turned particularly unpleasant.
Mom, what's going on? Is Alice arguing with you again?
Sarah then turned to Alice, adjusting the microphone volume to the maximum.
Alice, I'm not saying this to criticize you, but since you and Michael are divorced, you should part ways amicably. Why cling to the past? Don't you know what you've done?
David stood up gracefully, shielding Alice behind him. Sarah was momentarily stunned. Taking advantage of Sarah's distraction, David snatched the microphone from her hand, cleared his throat, and first addressed the two security guards.
Go to the HR department and settle your wages. Don't come to work from today onwards.
The older security guard realized they had offended someone they shouldn't have. He pulled the younger guard's sleeve, and they left dejectedly.
I know what kind of woman my fiancée is. Over the past period, you've heard many rumors about her. I want to take this opportunity to clarify everything.
Sarah finally realized something was wrong. She frantically lunged at David, trying to snatch the microphone and stop him from speaking. David dodged and instructed for well-trained bodyguards to come from the banquet hall entrance.
Two of you protect Alice. The other two, keep an eye on that woman.
David, holding the microphone, calmly walked onto the stage.
You've probably heard rumors about my fiancée. She is kind-hearted and pure. She married Mr. Liu, but unfortunately, he indulged in a life of excess and never came home, even having an affair with her former friend, Sarah. Sarah got pregnant, and they immediately kicked my fiancé out of the house. My fiancé didn't hold any grudges and left with nothing, returning to her parents' home. She didn't blame her ex-husband or resent Sarah. But from that day, rumors about her behavior spread throughout her workplace and neighborhood. That's when I met her. I saw her kindness and strength in adversity, and I couldn't help but be moved.
Avid, with a serious tone, recounted the events. But the rumors about my fiancé grew worse. Sarah even hired thugs to harm her, but I arrived just in time. Ara's face showed despair as she was watched by 2 bodyguards, unable to struggle. David continued, his tone calm but firm. At this point, you might wonder why Ara repeatedly slandered and spread rumors about my fiancé. It's because she felt insecure. Why did Ms. Ara feel insecure? Because the child she is carrying is not Michael's. Ara feared that one day Michael might change his mind and return to my fiancé, so she decided to act first.
Mrs. Davis nearly fainted, but was quickly helped to a chair by those around her.
R.S. Davis's voice was filled with anger and confusion. What makes you say that the child in Sarah's womb is not my grandchild? Avid bluntly revealed the truth. Because your son is infertile. R.S. Davis cursed, her voice shaking with fury. You're the one who's infertile. Your family is the one that will end. Avid remained calm, his tone serious. Michael had an examination at the city hospital. The results are still in the attending doctor's computer.
Mrs. Davis refused to believe it, but David ignored her and continued with his plan.
Avid's voice grew more serious. Sarah arranged for 3 or 4 thugs to wait outside my fiancé's home, intending to harm her when she went out. Fortunately, they didn't succeed. Soon after, rumors spread that my fiancé was involved with these thugs. So, who was really involved with the thugs? I think everyone here already knows. Avid instructed his men to bring in Sarah's lover, John, a notorious thug in the city.
David had found John on the night he returned to 1999 and had him beaten half to death, ensuring he was watched closely. When John saw David, he was so scared he confessed to everything.
Avid, with a tone of finality, announced, "Now the truth is out. The parties involved have the chance to defend themselves. Regardless, I don't want to hear any more slanderous remarks about my fiancé." Ara's face twisted with hatred as she glared at Alice. "Alice, even as a ghost, I won't let you go," she screamed in despair.
Meanwhile, Mrs. Davis had fainted, and Michael stood there in shock, temporarily speechless from the blow.
Avid stood and announced to the guests, his tone serious. "I have reported the defamation by Sarah and Mrs. Davis and the attempted assault by John. The police will be here shortly."
The guests felt like they were on a roller coaster, stunned by the series of revelations.
Avid saw no remorse in any of them, especially Mr. Clark, who was still leisurely drinking with the grade director. Avid ordered the bodyguards to take Sarah and John away to wait for the police.
Michael, looking lost, left with his mother. David picked up the microphone from the ground and addressed Mr. Clark.
Avid's tone was filled with sarcasm. "Mr. Clark, you seem to be enjoying yourself." Clark immediately stood up, and the grade directors and teachers from Alice's school at the surrounding tables also stood up, shamelessly raising their glasses. Avid glared at them, his voice filled with anger. "Mr. Clark, directors, teachers, on behalf of Alice, I hereby resign from her position as a language teacher at West District Elementary School." Before Mr. Clark could say a word, David furiously continued, "I believe that education is a long-term commitment, especially for children. Mr. Clark, you lack discernment. Sarah bribed you, and you immediately called to fire Alice. Some of your teachers are worse than animals and are unfit to be educators. I will report this to the education authorities." Avid took Alice's hand and led her away. The principal and teachers scattered, leaving the hotel to make connections. The remaining guests paused for a moment, then picked up their chopsticks and continued eating as if nothing had happened. Alice was already in tears.
I hadn't expected David to do so much for me silently.
Once they entered the room, Alice stood on tiptoe, wrapped her arms around David's waist, and kissed him eagerly. Her movements were clumsy but sincere.
It's okay, take your time.
They embraced and kissed for a long time until the police arrived, and David went to handle the aftermath. Alice, feeling uneasy, followed him downstairs shortly after. In the lobby, David was confidently conversing with the lawyer and the police, while Alice watched from a distance, admiring him.
What have I done to deserve this?
Indeed, what had she done to deserve David? The next day, Alice's brother, James, rushed home from school. Under David's planning, he and Alice held a grand wedding at the Jingxian Hotel. David planned to take Alice back to 2018 after the wedding, so he didn't put much effort into preparing the bridal chamber. He simply bought a 3-story villa with a courtyard in the commercial district, totaling over 1,000 square meters. In 1999, property prices were low, and the entire villa cost just over $1 million. James, studying at a top university, was modest and knowledgeable, uninterested in fame and fortune. He was not impressed by the villa David gifted but was curious about David's identity. He had researched the Jiangnan Cui family and found no one of David's stature in the younger generation, suspecting David to be a wealthy fraud. Out of concern for his sister, James bluntly called David out of the bridal chamber on their wedding night.
There's no one like you in the Jiangnan Cui family. Can you give me a reasonable explanation?
Avid looked at James with admiration.
Would you accept any explanation?
Ames nodded.
As long as you're sincere with my sister and won't harm her, I'll accept any explanation.
Avid asked an unrelated question.
I heard your major is quantum physics.
Ames was puzzled.
Yes, why do you ask?
Avid gently guided the conversation.
Do you believe there are other planets with life in the universe besides Earth?
Ames nodded affirmatively.
In the vast universe, Earth is not the only planet with life.
Avid paused, and then revealed the truth.
I come from a parallel planet 20 years in the future, 2018.
Ignoring James's shock, David continued explaining. He shared his plan to take Alice with him. Of course, James found it hard to believe such a fantastical story and needed proof.
Here's a phone from 2018. Let me show you the changes science has brought to the world.
James, shocked, had to believe it. He asked,
How will you take my sister back?
Avid replied,
I have a time machine that can accommodate 2 people. I plan to take her tomorrow.
Ames, curious and expectant, inquired further.
Can I see it?
Avid explained his plan.
Tomorrow, I'll tell your sister we're going south. After she falls asleep, I'll take her. You can come over then. James, I don't belong to this era. I need to return to my time, but I must take your sister. She's the most important woman in my life. Alice is worried about you all, so please take care of our mother.
Ames asked sadly.
Will you ever come back?
Avid replied uncertainly.
I don't know. If we can, we will.
The scientist who invented the time machine was gravely ill, and no one else knew how to power it. Leaning against the railing, David solemnly instructed James.
Meeting your sister is the greatest fortune of my life. To be honest, she's already expecting. I want to take her away as soon as possible. I didn't want to tell anyone, but I must respect her family. James, I hope you'll be a man and take good care of our mother.
Ames could see how much his sister loved David.
Do you plan to tell her the truth after returning to 2018?
Avid didn't answer, gazing at the stars, which was a silent acknowledgement.
The stars in 2018 aren't as bright as they are now. Don't worry, I won't let Alice down.
After the homecoming banquet, David bid farewell to Mrs. Brown.
Mom, I'm taking Alice back to the south. We'll come back to see you in a while.
R.S. Brown was reluctant, but happy her daughter had found a good match. That night, Alice, David, and James stayed in a room at the Jingxian Hotel. David transferred all the hotel's shares to James, as he might never return. The three of them ate snacks and chatted in a room. James clung to Alice.
Once Alice fell asleep, David opened the wardrobe, revealing a virtual time machine to James.
James, it's time to say goodbye.
David picked up Alice and stepped into the time machine. James stood outside, watching his sleeping sister with teary eyes. He prayed in his heart.
Sis, you must be happy.
In the vast universe, there is always someone meant for you. For you, he is willing to give up the whole world and travel through time to love you. Before he arrives, be brave and love yourself well.